Okay, we are back. I had some technical issues last time, and I broke my streak twice because the Caterpie ran away. So today I'm going to have to review the annotated bib entries that I missed and keep pressing. I'm not sure how long I'll stream, but we'll go for a little bit. I'm just calling Nightbot. Just to make sure that they're here. Alright. Oh, just get my controller going. Should be charged, but we'll see. There we go. Yeah, run away. So we have 7 Pokeballs. I'm just gonna get down to where we left off with the annotated bib. We went over a lot of good stuff last time. I think we stopped at Frost. Yeah. Alright, so I'm gonna try to split screen this for me, for you. You'll just see this. It's not that exciting, but that's fine. Alright, gotta lay out my notes. I am joined, of course, by my research assistants, who are my dogs. We got R2 and Tosca, and it's been raining here, so they don't want to be inside, you know. That's Blake, Kogos at home. We got Sharindo, Dawson, Tom, and then Frost. Okay, I wrote these on a sticky note to try and help myself. Alright, we're running, because we gotta save Pokeballs. I want to see if I can get this big pearl. I would assume we have to wait some time before we can get money again from Slowpoke. But when we talk about technical communication, which is what I'm studying and getting my PhD in, I'm in my 2nd year of coursework, almost 3rd year, but yeah, 2nd year. What is TechCom? TechCom is essentially translating complex information into a format that's easy to understand for a specific audience. What does that mean for us as technical communicators? Basically, the goal is to help someone do or understand something. How do we accomplish this? How do we translate complex information into a format that's easy to understand? Well, we use clear language, so this would be audience-centered. So the difficulty is adjusted based on the audience. So if you're working with kindergartners, right, and trying to help them leverage a document, brochure, pamphlet to wash their hands, then that difficulty would be different than if you're trying to explain documentation to a team of engineers, right? So this also means that we need it to be action-oriented because we're getting the user to do something. In the case of the engineers, that means, oh, I need to sell. We're trying to get them to do something with the documentation. Read it, understand it, make it better, right? Sell the big pearl. And then it's design focused. What that means is we may potentially, based on the audience, need to use charts, diagrams, graphs, and something like a clean layout, which would differ from something that's a little bit messier. Like documentation may not have a lot of data visualization, but it probably will have some degree of screenshots, maybe. Caterpie candy. Candy that is packed with energy when given to certain Pokemon. It will increase all their stats at once. I've never seen that. Okay. Alright. This is probably too many Pokeballs, but that's alright. Lay down, buddy. This is my dog, R2. Good boy. Good puppy. Alright, so what are some real-world examples? In the Pokemon world, we might look at how-to guides, tutorials, walkthroughs, things to help you win in Pokemon Go, in the Battle League, or maybe in this game, how to level up your team, right? Or even shiny guides, right? That would be another example. There's also labels where I didn't know what Caterpie candies were, and so a label popped up that tells us what the item is, what it does, how we use it. That's also an example of technical communication. We can also think of this in terms of patch notes. So the developers push updates to the software, which is important because it helps the user experience, helps the player in the game. And then we might look at also help files. This could be like Bulbapedia, crowdsourced documentation that often have like FAQs, shiny stats, sprites, general information about Pokemon that's more crowdsourced, even though it's not official documentation from Nintendo, right? Or Game Freak, for example. It is still an example of technical communication. Last time we talked a little bit about rhetoric, and I brought up this idea of the rhetorical triangle. That's generally, I think, how most of us understood rhetoric. It's ethos, logos, pathos. But there's also a fourth one, and in some ways I think of this as the rhetorical trapezoid or rhombus or square, diamond, if you will. I'm afraid this is gonna run away. So we have ethos, which is character, credibility, and ethics. Ethos for ethics. I think I need to run away from this. Then we have logos, which is facts, data, logic. And then we have pathos, which is passion and or emotion. I like to think of it as emotion. The fourth one we addressed briefly is this thing called kairos. And what kairos is context and or time. And this helps us because it grounds the rhetorical situation. The context and time of the rhetoric is important, which is why I like to think of it more of like a rhombus, trapezoid, or square instead of just a rhetorical triangle. I think kairos is necessary. But what about other forms of rhetoric? We don't just have those four. We have more. Rhetoric can be used to persuade or inform. And then also ethos, logos, pathos, and kairos. Thinking of informing or persuading, we talked about the essay written by George Orwell in 1946 titled The Politics of the English Language. And one of the key concepts, the key takeaways, is this idea presented that our thoughts become language and our language becomes thoughts. So it's a double arrow. One more time. Our thoughts become language and our language become thoughts. So this is important. I gave the example last time of this educator, Paulo Freire, who was in Brazil and went to a fishing and farming village and realized that the adults could not read or write, and they were voting against their own interests because they didn't understand what the language was saying. So he basically just taught them to read and write and allowed them to gain the language to understand their position, their plight, and where they fit into the society. And this was what he developed to become critical pedagogy. And it's also an example of adult learners. And adult learners learn differently than kids. There's a lot of data within education that supports this. So I bring this up because for those farmers and fishermen, they lacked the language, but understanding to read and write allowed them access to that language that was otherwise gatekept by institutional forces or systemic forces. Please don't run away, Caterpie. So this is important. Our thoughts become language, our language become thoughts. And we also talked about how the language surrounding risk has changed. This is specific to the annotated bibliography. We talked about Beck. He is a philosopher, essentially, of technology, and he really posits and puts forth this argument that we're living in a modern society that is steeped in risk. It's anticipated, it's staged, and it's globally mediated. There's so many cocoon over here. What's going on? There's a oddish, Caterpie. So what it means to anticipate risk, think of like weather warnings. We know a storm might be coming. Something tells you, an app on your phone or the news, that there's going to be a big storm. You should get ready for thunderstorms or tornadoes or hurricanes. That would be anticipating risk. Staging risk would be the example of the article last time, which was frost. And that was when an organization responded to an oil spill. They had to stage their reaction to that risk. And then saying that it's globally mediated means that this risk is not localized to a single place. Risk as a concept is something that everyone faces on a global scale. There's also a couple of concepts that Beck makes sure to point out. One is that risk is manufactured. In other words, it's created. And he makes the argument that risk is industrialized, essentially. Things like climate change, which he argues is a direct result of industrialization. So that is manufactured. He also talks about that risk is constructed, meaning if we get on an airplane, we are bringing ourselves a degree of risk, which is why they have the safety warnings of fasten your seatbelt, and if the oxygen mask drops down, don't run away, Caterpie. Then put the mask on. Oh boy. That was a terrible throw. Beck also talks about this idea that risk is also largely invisible, that we may not consider or think about it, but it's there, it's present. How can risk be invisible? We can think of risk being invisible in how it's communicated rhetorically. For example, if you're trading stocks online, the dashboards you use might be a form of invisible risk. You just buy the stock. It's communicated through that technical infrastructure where you press the button, the buy button. That's very easy, and it sort of removes you from that risk of trading a stock. And then Beck also highlights this idea that risk is communicated by experts generally. And we came across a couple of other articles. For example, Blake is one that carries forward this idea of the anticipation, staging, in manufacturing of risk, also this idea of experts. For a long time in technical communication, the risk communication considered, like the scholarship considered, that experts distill knowledge down to the layperson. And so Blake is basically arguing, hey, this deficit model doesn't fit like the modern times of us. It doesn't make sense for us to follow that, because risk is also about, according to Blake, power, culture, and participation. And he argues that often those experts gatekeep knowledge. So he is wary of accepting a deficit top-down model of experts distilling risk to the layperson as the only way to navigate technical communication. In other words, Blake is saying that risk is instead an ecosystem. And if we're thinking about being in online spaces, YouTube, for example, Discord, Reddit, these other platforms, risk would be considered an ecosystem. There are a lot of trees, if you will. We have trees of bots and users and dashboards and community threads and Bulbapedia with knowledge that's co-curated by community. But there's also the trees, hence the ecosystem of official documentation within Pokemon, like Game Freak / Niantic, their FAQs, and so on. And in other words, putting this all together, Blake makes this argument that risk is socially constructed and that it's rhetorical. It's doing something, it's persuading, it's informing, it's staging, anticipating. Those are all forms of rhetoric. And that risk is participatory, meaning it involves humans in our navigation and mediation of that risk. I'm gonna throw a berry here. We also get introduced to this idea of Kobos et al. And we're thinking of this article more in terms of potentially methods or methodology. They use this idea of interfaces, which they argue are kind of connection points tensions, possibilities between culture and rhetoric. And one of the key things in this article is they actually do not define cultural rhetoric, because in doing so, they assert that the definition becomes exclusionary. The authors talk about this idea of interfaces as a way to understand cultural rhetorics as a framework through nonlinearity, marginalized voices, as a way of being deeply embodied and relational. I can think of two examples that address the broader implications of this. One is indigenous epistemologies, indigenous ways of being and knowing, which, as stewards of the earth, talk about this idea of 7 generations. So they're concerned with what's happening now, but they're actually more concerned with thinking 7 generations in the future. And I know you're thinking, okay, at first glance, this is fairly linear, but this is an idea of nonlinearity. They're thinking into the future and the past. So that would be a type of interface. You go out, you interview marginalized voices that aren't necessarily chronological in terms of who they are, how they embody cultural rhetoric frameworks. And then the second example is this idea, it's an African principle, Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. I am because you are. In other words, I exist because you exist. It's about relationships. After this, we move towards Doss and Tom, and they're concerned with this question of who is considered an expert. And they reject or disavow the idea of top-down framework or a corporate architecture. The distilling down deficit that Blake mentions, Doss and Tom reject that, and they say, hey, we need to actually look at this peer-to-peer idea. And what this does is allow co-curation of knowledge and co-creation of experts that don't traditionally hold the credentials to be an expert, but have that community ethos, that community credibility to leverage existing documentation to become voices of expertise, essentially. One example we can see is, again, I have conflicting information. The shiny odds specific to Let's Go Eevee and Let's Go Pikachu are 1 in 325 once we hit that 31 catch combo. But I've also read that it's 1 in 341. That 31 catch combo was crowdsourced, and it wasn't revealed until some other developers and software engineers within the community surfed through the metadata and kind of found, hey, they actually need a 31 catch combo. Then your 30-second encounter will be the 1 of 325 odds. And then if you catch it, your 33rd encounter will be 1 in 325, right? So we have a ways to go here with our Caterpie. Doss and Tom are also just reiterating a technical communication in a networked age, right? Whose voices are boosted? Whose are amplified, right? Who is left out? Who's privileged? Who is mediated? And how does that challenge the system? Dang it. Hopefully we get that Caterpie. So you can kind of see how these elements of risk are traced throughout these pieces, along with whose voices are amplified or excluded. And a framework like Kobos et al. Is important because it centers the marginalized voices. Catch combo 20. Still a ways to go. I wonder, see if I can go get some more Pokeballs. We also talked about a text last time that is all about precarious publics. And remember, precarious public is a community that co-creates knowledge and manages risk in real time. Why this matters is we're thinking about potentially communities being on platforms that lack structured information architecture. Maybe they lack version control or even archival resilience. They're precarious publics because their ability to exist could be erased. So if Reddit didn't think that the community of Pokemon Go players deserved to be on there anymore, right, they could disband that community. And where would that community go? Would they go to a backup server? Would they go to Discord? Where might they move to? Or would they just disband, right? So precarious publics are communities that co-curate knowledge, but their way of being and operating is unstable and vulnerable. That might be a better way to think of it. They're vulnerable. Why are they vulnerable? Because they exist in top-down systems. Chirindo is pretty clear in that top-down infrastructure, that corporate infrastructure, being risky to publics that are bottom-up or peer-to-peer. That means that the risk that precarious publics take on is uneven compared to the corporate structures, the corporate agents. And that also means that those publics experience a degree of economic or legal precarity. Which means that these publics, remember, they're vulnerable. They often have an institutional distrust. Why do they have an institutional distrust? Because the platforms and institutions and infrastructures determine who can speak, who can be heard, or who's dismissed or erased even. Catch combo 21. Still looking for Caterpie. Oh, there might be one. Alright, which brings us to one of my favorite articles, which was written by Frost. And remember, Frost is a technical communicator, and they looked at the oil spill at Dauphine Island, which is in Florida. I'm going to give this guy a berry. I don't want to break the streak. And when this oil spill happened, it was in international waters. So the international government had to get involved. The federal government had to get involved for the United States and the state government of Florida. Why this matters is because at the time, BP, which is an oil company, was renting this ship. So they were basically responsible for the spill. There was also, at the time, a real estate company that had an interest in keeping summer properties full of tenants, renters, or rich people that come down to vacation in the summers. So they had a vested interest in this oil spill because they had properties that they still needed to rent out and lease and make money on. The other piece is, how did this impact the locals? Well, the fishermen, because of the oil spill, were out of a job. They couldn't fish. They were out of work, right? So the state government posted resources down at the docks that was basically like, if you're impacted by this oil spill, here's some resources to help tide you over. Meanwhile, BP actually posted flyers down in this area recruiting those same fishermen. In other words, BP was like, there's this oil spill. You can help us out and clean it up, and we'll pay you to do it. So there's some tensions emerging. Give me just 1 second. My dog is wanting to go outside, so I'll be right back. Hang in there. 1 moment. Alright, sorry about that. I'm gonna run away from this Pidgey. So just to recap, basically Frost was looking at several different communities and how they responded to the risk of this oil spill. And again, that was the international government, federal and state government, BP, the oil company, real estate, and then locals in the community. And each of those leveraged different rhetorical techniques and handled the risk differently. Again, for the locals, they also started a blog, which was unusual at the time. So they leveraged an online discourse community to stay informed. Meanwhile, the real estate agency ended up using a website to post updates about the news. Their language that they leveraged surrounding the oil spill had a vested interest to keep it as neutral and almost positive sounding, right? They would highlight cleanup portions because they needed people to come in and rent that real estate. Oh man, our streak just broke. I am not having luck with this Caterpie. Anyway, the rhetorical motivations for each of these agencies differed. BP had a vested interest in keeping things as neutral as possible, shirking responsibility and accountability. They were the ones that essentially caused the oil spill. But, you know, they don't want their stock to drop. So they're going to use language that sort of skirts that accountability piece, and they're going to even try to hire the fishermen to come clean up the mess. Frost also introduced this term that's key to this article, and it's called glocally. That's spelled Glocally, glocally. And what it means is to merge the global and local risk. Again, this is an excellent example of this term because we have international players, federal and state governments, and then locals, as well as corporations involved, real estate, and then BP, right? Frost highlights that risk is a deeply embodied experience specific to the locals trying to navigate this crisis online through blogging. why does this matter? Like, what is the problem that Frost is getting at? The reason she looked at these 5 different actors is because the official messages failed to account for the cultural, economic, and affective and material tensions. So that is why the locals responded with a blog. That's why the real estate agency responded with a website, and the other agencies responded with flyers and pamphlets, respectively. Another thing that Frost highlights is this idea of risk being transcultural. In this case, trans means across cultures. And this is a key term as well, because in the ecosystem of risk, many of these actors were impacted, and they work across cultures. We can think of culture in this term: the corporate structure, the local structure, the government structure. So I really love Frost's article because it integrates this idea of rhetoric we've been talking about, the kairos, the context and time, ethos, logos, pathos, of course, that each of those agencies used rhetoric as a degree to inform or persuade, and that all of them use different types of documents to convey that. It's a very complicated setup, and this ecosystem impacted a lot of people. You know, folks were out of jobs, real estate people tried to still get folks to rent property. And they were all sort of navigating, mediating, and responding to risk in real time as best they could. So it really brings together all of these concepts that we're talking about. I don't know if we're ever going to get a shiny Caterpie. This is such upbeat, playful music. It's a really stark contrast compared to reading annotated bibliography entries, or at least trying to understand them. And why am I doing this? I'm trying to study for my dissertation prep, and these are some articles that I've read, so I'm trying to sort of use the stream as a form of body doubling. Here's a Caterpie. Okay, so what I'm going to do is read this annotated bibliography entry that I have written, and then I'm going to try to synthesize why it's important to the existing literature that we've covered. Okay, so this article is by Hesford, Lincona, and Teston. It is called Introduction, Rhetorical Recalibrations and Responsibilities. It was published in the book Precarious Rhetorics, and it was also published by Ohio State University Press, and it has a DOI, which is the Document Object Identifier. It is the URL that will be on the internet forever. It's where you can find the article forever, and APA is requiring more scholarship to include DOIs to build a archival repository of technical scholarship like this. All right, so Hesford, Lincona, and Teston, in their introduction, offer the stakes of studying rhetoric in contexts of precarity. They argue that rhetorical scholarship needs to address uneven material, political, and affective vulnerabilities shaped by systems. They create a term called responsibility, and that's hyphenated, as a type of rhetorical mode and also an ethical imperative. This means that the authors foreground who is positioned to respond, under what conditions, and with what consequences. They use an interdisciplinary frame of precarity that moves beyond a simple economic condition. Precarity in this sense is both economic and rhetorical, with relations and constraints. Their theoretical move is to critique the normalization of crisis discourse. We need to understand how rhetorical action sustains and resists precarious systems. However, the most important element is the idea that using precarity as a framework challenges the field to engage with the lived realities of marginalized people whose identities, labor, and ways of being and knowing are treated as deficits and thus disposable. These authors are implicitly positioned as rhetorical scholars and as embedded participants within precarious systems. This text is both conceptual and theoretical, as it outlines how rhetorical infrastructures shape and respond to economic precarity. Okay, so what is it that Hesper, Lincona, and Teston are saying? I think the key piece here is this idea of precarity, and that it is not just an economic constraint. It can be geographical, relational, embodied as well. And I think that is the move that they're making. Oh, I just ran into a Pidgey. Whoops. Alright. Next one is Jensen. It comes from 2015. And it is The Rhetoric of Risk. This was published in the Sage Handbook of Risk Communication. Alright, I wrote, Jensen's chapter highlights and traces rhetorical tensions within risk communication. Jensen highlights how definitions of risk are shaped by competing discourses, institutional power, and cultural contexts. Jensen argues that risk is never neutral. It becomes a rhetorical construction or a social construct that embeds values, exclusions, and political consequences. Even though Jensen's examples demonstrate how rhetorics are deployed in public health, environmental justice, and crisis response, Jensen focuses on how these deployments frame subjects and objects of risk and how they influence affect and temporal dimensions of risk, such as anticipation, fear, and uncertainty. Jensen also magnifies how individuals and communities create their own counter-rhetorics of risk, where institutional narratives fail to address lived experiences. Even though this is more of a theoretical article, Jensen's work here offers examples of how dominant risk frameworks conceal structural inequalities and oppress alternative epistemologies. This source is a conceptual snapshot and literature review source that can help theorize how communities rhetorically negotiate economic risk and distrust dominant narratives. It's worth noting that in relation to Jensen, thinking about risk communication, the field of technical communication actually got its foundation from rhetoric scholars, and many of them moved into technical communication. But why this is relevant is because we often talk about, in the field of scholarship, the rhetoric of health and medicine, or the rhetoric of science, health, and medicine. So the reason Jensen's article here is significant is because he's leveraging examples of risk within health and medicine. And this is a body of literature that is pretty tight surrounding those. It's very rare to talk about the rhetoric of finance or the rhetoric of precarity. So Jensen's extension of risk communication is basically arguing that communities are shaped by the institutional powers, that top-down framework, but also cultural contexts, and that negotiating and anticipating risk is something that communities must do. This echoes a lot of what Beck was talking about in terms of his work in the book A Risk Society. So Jensen's article is basically extending Beck. I wonder if we should put Huckleberry in a box so he doesn't continue to grow. I'm worried he's going to become too powerful. Oh, lots of Pidgeys around here. Next up, we have Jones, Moore, and Walton. This was published in 2016. It's titled Disrupting the Past to Disrupt the Future, an anti-narrative of technical communication. This was published in Technical Communication Quarterly, and it also has a DOI, which is its permanent address and where it lives in perpetuity on the internet. We're running from this Pidgey. This is a foundational article because it starts the social justice turn. Will we find a Caterpie that's shiny? These authors critique how technical communication sanitizes and justifies and obscures institutional actions through neutral-sounding discourse. Jones, Moore, and Walton move toward a social justice angle which constellates in coalition. Please don't run away, Caterpie. The authors underscore that technical communicators need to consider marginalized publics through ethical and participatory frameworks. The article reveals one way to examine how communities resist and subvert institutional expediency. But the nuance is that these communities leverage grassroots infrastructures where publics reframe risk. So I put this in context with Wall Street Bets, which is a Reddit Discord group, a Reddit discourse community, I should say. And so I use them as an example. Wall Street Bets, for example, create a participatory ethos, community-centered documentation, and rhetorical performance. Their work helps us reconsider that financial publics function as tactical technical communicators, where dominant narratives are challenged, subverted, and negotiated through a rhetorical infrastructure, where trust and expertise arise from users who become experts in digital spaces. I mentioned in this little summary here that I had written this idea of tactical, technical communication, and using this model of top down. Corporations use strategies to exert influence and power through their institutions based on their architecture. I'm going to run from this Kakuna. Users in that community, think employees, oh man, we're running at everything today, use tactics. Corporations use strategies. They exert technological pressure on their employees or users of technology. But users or employees, for example, they leverage tactics. And when we think of tactics, anything that subverts that top-down exertion. So in the Pokemon community, that would be do-it-yourself tutorials, gym walkthroughs. These are not official guides, right? This is a YouTuber or a streamer helping you beat Brock or find a hidden item or tap into a evolution of something. That would be tactics. I'm forgetting the exact context, but there is a scholar, his name's Spinuzzi, and he basically studied this timing of rhetoric at an institution where he watched a worker, a secretary, write a love letter on company time, and she was writing it on sticky notes. And so the tactic is she was subverting that exertion and pressure and power and not really doing her work. She was writing a love letter, right? That would be tactical, technical communication. She's communicating with the technology, a pen and pencil. I know, Spinuzzi goes way back. We're talking like the technology there is a little bit goofy. I know some folks don't consider a pen or a pencil technology, but that is how technical scholars consider. And that's why Spinuzzi was really interested in this. So he sort of brings that concept forward, and we begin to see traces of it in other instances. So the Jones, Moore, and Walton article is important because, again, it's centering marginalized voices as a way of communicating and generating a different alternative discourse that is not of corporations, not of the standard models. So let's see, I'm going to scroll down. All right, the next article, I think this is, oh darn, I missed the Caterpie, the last article in this annotated bibliography, but I do have another one that I'll switch over to. This article I really like. It sort of blends this idea of rhetoric and a more modern definition of ethos. And remember, ethos is credibility, ethics, character. Is that a Caterpie? It is. Here we go. This is from Kober and Al-Shaif. Probably mispronouncing that, but that's okay. It was published in 2025, which is the most recent article right now that I have in my list of sources. It's titled, "What's Crazy is Look How Better I Got." It's kind of a weird title. Rethinking Ethos in the Crisis of Perpetual Stasis. It was published in the journal Rhetoric Society Quarterly, and it also has a DOI. Kober and Al-Shaif's article makes an intervention on current discourses on misinformation and scientific credibility. They critique the overuse of the term misinformation as a rhetorical frame, and they argue that it reinforces polarization and immobilizes public discourse instead of enabling rhetorical movement. They offer 2 case studies on Joe Rogan and Eveland. Eveland, I believe, is another popular YouTuber, and illustrate how labeling ideas on misinformation shuts down engagement, which deepens insider-outsider divides. I'm sorry, there's an echo on my audio. Let me turn myself down. Okay, I think that's better. I'm hoping you can still hear me. If not, oh well. Alright, they offer 2 case studies on Joe Rogan and Evelyn and illustrate how labeling ideas on misinformation shuts down engagement, which deepens insider and outsider divides. They also theorize a crisis of perpetual stasis, in which ethos is no longer a stable credential. Instead, they offer that ethos is a dynamic, rhetorical performance that is shaped by boundary, affect, and cultural context. The implications for cultural rhetorics, technical systems, and risk communication is that ethos is performed through speakers and through interface design. Interface design here means user interface, which is UX. My phone is ringing. I'm gonna decline it. Sorry. Their framework helps explain how communities resist rhetorical stasis because communities develop alternative forms of credibility, community ethos, and participatory knowledge making outside of institutional voices and in a way that leans into peer-to-peer knowledge making. Basically, what this highlights is the idea of rhetorical stasis. When we're online for a long time, we end up being part of the attention economy, where in this case, we scroll on videos, we watch it, and the next one plays. Rhetoric largely depends on deliberation, taking a breath, taking time to really critically examine and critically think about the arguments within these documents, videos, shorts, Discord conversations. But if we're always online, we don't have that rhetorical stasis. We don't have the off ramp to breathe. So this article by Kober and Alshive is highlighting the rhetorical stasis is in crisis. When you're chronically online, you don't have time to digest, critically examine, or critically think. So that's their commentary. All right. Our next entry is actually one of my favorites. It is by 2 Italian authors. Oh, that's a terrible throw. It is Petrucci and Cicerelli, and it's called Scientists, Citizens, Rhetoric and Responsibility in L'Aquila, Rhetoric and Public Affairs. Looking for Caterpie. Taking a break, looking for Caterpie. Spinning my wheels like a hamster on a wheel. Looking for Caterpie. That's Weedle. Where are you, Caterpie? Maybe I should go. No, there's nothing over there. Okay. In this article, the authors investigate the 2009 L'Aquila earthquake and the prosecutions of scientists accused of miscommunicating risk to the public. They analyze how competing rhetorical constructions of responsibility, expertise, and uncertainty emerged in the wake of the disaster. Their primary argument is that there needs to be a model of scientist-citizen who must balance technical authority and civic responsibility, especially in situations of high uncertainty and potential catastrophe. The authors criticize the gap between institutional science and public understanding. They emphasize the need for rhetorical attunement of risk. Even though this case focuses on seismic risk, the implications extend to any scenario where public trust, expert discourse, and lived vulnerability intersect. Thus, this article is highly relevant to risk communication in volatile digital spaces. Their work parallels and deepens discussion around transparency, rhetorical agency, and the ethics of predictive discourse. It offers us a model of how rhetorical frameworks can analyze breakdowns in trust and technocratic authority. Alright, so we mentioned Blake talking about this model of risk that sees experts that distill risk down to the layman. This is a deficit model. The L'Aquila earthquake that happened in 2009 was super interesting because essentially the context of this meant that a bunch of seismic geologists, the best in the world, got together and talked about whether or not this little town of L'Aquila would have an earthquake. And up until that point, folks were sleeping in their cars instead of their houses because they thought that it was safer than living in their house with the potential of an earthquake. And these experts got together, they had this discussion panel of really high language that was specific to their community. Think like heavy geology, terms, commentary, statistics, data. And they covered the data. The only issue was, at the time, there was a reporter that had been invited to this panel. And the reporter recorded live and asked a few questions to these experts. And one of those was essentially like, should the people of L'Aquila be worried? Should they be concerned? And the experts said no. Well, they downplayed the possibility of having an earthquake. And there was an earthquake, and it destroyed the town, and some people lost their lives. And so the government of Italy put them on trial, put the scientists on trial, and basically made the case of like, you did not do enough to inform the everyday lay person that there was risk involved. So it's a very interesting article that sort of brings together a few of these concepts that we're talking about. This idea of whose responsibility is it? Is it the expert to communicate effectively? Is it on the layman to just simply blindly trust the expert? Or does the layman have responsibility now to educate themselves? And if so, what does that look like? And it also means, can you trust the experts if they get it wrong? So that is a very good article in terms of we're seeing these concepts of risk come together, whose voice is silenced, whose is excluded, whose is centered, right? Oh, I think we found it. Oh man. I'm so nervous. Okay, let's feed him a berry. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Wow. That's crazy. Oh my gosh. I totally missed. We're taking a break. We're trying to catch the shiny before we move to the next entry. This is awesome. How goofy. Can't believe it. Catch combo 20. Give me just a second. Well, what should we name him? Anyone have any ideas? The rules dictate, since chat is not here, that I name Caterpie. Probably gonna go with I'm gonna go with Magenta, maybe? For magenta highlighter. Magenta. I would like to find a shiny Bulbasaur. I think that would be a great addition to our team. But for now, I'm gonna go back to the mart. Oh. What was that? Oh. More Bulbasaur. Oh, I always get lost in Viridian Forest. Alright, I know what you really came here for. Are the annotated bibliography. We're moving, we're moving. Taking a break, taking a break, taking a break on studying. See if we can get more money from watching Slowpoke. Nope, not yet. There must be a limitation. That's okay. I think with catching so much Pokemon, we'll have some stuff to sell. Which will hopefully get us some candy. Alright, before we hunt Bulbasaur, I'll be right back. I'm gonna go check on the dogs. Be back. One moment. Okay, sorry about that. I'm back. I hope there's not an echo with the audio. It is lagging a little bit. Okay, we are now hunting Bulbasaur. And here's the next entry. This was written by Yang and Magic in 2004. Oh, it's called Pathological Liars, Algorithmic Knowing in the Rhetorical Ecosystem of Wall Street Bets. Wow, there's so much here. It was published in the Rhetoric Society Quarterly, and it has a DOI, which we've already discussed. Okay. Yang and Magic offer a rhetorical term, pathologics, which combines pathos and fuses it to logos. The authors show that Wall Street Bets authority often emerges through pathologics, which is affect logic that attract engagement and ripple into legacy media on a short lag. The authors offer an empirical body of evidence where they analyzed nearly 18,000 posts that had pathologics, illustrating that authority uptake within the subreddit. The implication of pathologics is that Wall Street Bets diffuses outward. The subreddit's pathologics lead CNBC transcript pathologics by roughly 7 days, where the evidence suggests rhetorical drift into legacy media. Additionally, this article does some heavy lifting with methodological invention since the authors used a fine-tuned BERT classifier on sentence level units to detect pathologics at scale. An example of rhetoric with AI paired with a reflexive critique of the rhetoric of AI, which is fragile data pipelines, platform API policies, representativeness, and environmental costs. What this highlights is that the rhetorical objects like memes, hybrid DDs, sarcastic sentiment posts, and more are only legible, powerful, or even possible because of the community-driven affordances, infrastructure, and rules developed on the back end, which is the tactical technical communication. In tandem, the pathologics and the tactical technical communication form a bottom-up knowledge system in a hostile financial and platform space. All right. I think that is it for the annotated bibliography. This looks like it'll be a hard Pokemon to catch. Oh no. Let's try it again. Nope. So that article is highlighting essentially that pathos and logos are they are remixed, mashed up, and have fused to become something completely different that merges pathos and logos. And what it suggests is that through sentiment analysis memes, DD posts, and so on, of those posts in Wall Street Bets, that the community had a pulse on what was happening before traditional news sources like CNBC did, meaning that in some ways the speed of information that was distributed within Wall Street Bets occurred faster than the news source could grasp. In fact, the news source lagged, actually, compared to Wall Street Bets. We're looking for Bulbasaur. I think that's a really cool article, and I do believe that it highlights also the degree to which some communities are active that rely on different forms of rhetoric and mediate and navigate risk in real time. I think that we could probably say Wall Street Bets might be a precarious public. Where are the Bulbasaur? I think there's gonna be really hard to catch these Pokemon. I remember seeing some of them over here. I do want to try to catch some more Bulbasaur. I really look forward to streaming and using this space as a time to study, as a way to body double. We're kind of striking out. And we're only on a catch combo of 1, I think, for the Bulbasaur. I think one of the reasons I enjoy doing this is because there's a degree of certainty in catching shinies. Like, there's sort of a method, and we work within the technological constraints of the technology. And there's a linearity to this, right? Find the Pokemon, catch it, level it up, beat the gym leaders. Whereas life, you know, with a PhD, I don't know that I'll get a job, right? Like, there's no guarantee that I'll find something, that I'll even be able to use my skills. So this gives a degree of certainty. Where are the Bulbasaur? Where are they? Oh. Where are the Bulbasaur? Just as a review, we talked today about some more rhetorical concepts, some more articles that help situate this idea of risk in risk communication, but also rhetoric and technical communication as well. Alright, well, I think this is a good stopping point. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. I will catch up with you later.